We now turn to the topic of discrimination and how economists think about the different sources of discrimination that we see in the world. In fact, we've already encountered one source of discrimination in our discussion of markets with asymmetric information. In car insurance markets, for example, we see higher premiums being charged to young drivers than to older drivers. That's because young drivers are more likely to get into accidents than older drivers, even though there are some young drivers that are perfectly safe drivers, and some older drivers that are horrifically unsafe drivers. On average, young people get into accidents more often than older people, and so in the absence of information about individual driving behavior, car insurance companies use age as a way to distinguish between people and discriminate based on age. We see the same thing happening in health insurance markets, where in a separating equilibrium, older people are charged higher premiums than younger people because older people are more likely to use healthcare and therefore impose costs on health insurance companies. Of course, there are young people who use healthcare heavily, and there are older people who are so healthy they hardly ever see a doctor. But on average, older people impose higher costs on health insurance companies, and so health insurance companies discriminate based on age when they're allowed to do so. These are forms of what we call statistical discrimination. So statistical discrimination is the use of statistical information about groups to infer something about members of those groups. So when we think about discrimination in markets, one source of discrimination is that firms lack information about individuals. But they observe group differences. And then they use those group differences to infer something about individuals. That's statistical discrimination. Think about life insurance, for example. If you go to buy life insurance, you'll notice that life insurance companies have different tables of premiums based on different categories of people. Smokers, for example, are charged higher premiums than non-smokers because smokers are more likely to die sooner than non-smokers. Or young people are charged lower premiums than older people because older people are more likely to die sooner than younger people. So life insurance companies discriminate based on age. They also discriminate based on gender. Women on average live longer lifespans than men. So life insurance companies discriminate against men by charging them higher premiums. These are all forms of statistical discrimination. Life insurance companies don't have enough information about individuals, and so they use these group differences to infer something about individuals. And on average, they're going to be right more often than they're wrong, and so they benefit from using information about groups to infer something about individuals. Now, this kind of discrimination is different from the kind of discrimination that we usually think of when we hear the term discrimination. Usually what we think of is discrimination that's based on prejudice. An economist called this kind of discrimination taste discrimination. So taste discrimination is the use of taste-based biases against groups to determine how to treat members of those groups. So, you may simply not like certain groups, and as a result you'll treat members of those groups differently. That's what we mean by discrimination based on prejudice. Now, when we look at life insurance companies and their discrimination against smokers, older people, and men, there's no particular reason to think that life insurance companies have some kind of taste-based bias against smokers or older people or men. Rather, they're just statistically discriminating. But sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between statistical discrimination and taste-based discrimination. Suppose, for example, that life insurance companies discriminated based on race. In fact, they did that until 1964, when it became illegal to racially discriminate in life insurance markets because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Life insurance companies might argue that in the 1950s, we see that African Americans on average live shorter lifespans than white Americans, just like men live shorter lifespans than women. And that's still true today. So life insurance companies might say, look, we're not biased against African Americans, we're simply using the underlying statistical information about groups to infer something about individuals, just as we do when we discriminate against smokers and older people and men. But it may also be that the reason life insurance companies discriminated based on race is that they were racially prejudiced. I suspect there was some of each, but sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the two, which raises the issue of why do we care where the source of discrimination comes from? Isn't there some form of discrimination that's simply objectionable, and aren't there other forms of discrimination that are less objectionable? And regardless of where the source of the discrimination is, we should fight against the forms of discrimination that we object against. Isn't racial discrimination one of those forms? Well, the answer to that may very well be yes. But understanding the source of the discrimination helps us understand what we might need to do to combat the discrimination. We're not saying that statistical discrimination is always good and taste-based discrimination is always bad. There are some instances of taste-based discrimination that we're perfectly fine with. We have in the US, for example, retirement communities, where individuals move to live around other people who are retired and not live around families with children. I personally don't understand that taste. I would always want to live in communities where there are children. But some people have a taste, as they get older, to live around other people who are retired and to have children come and visit, but not stay. We seem to not have a problem with people establishing retirement communities, even though that's a form of taste-based discrimination. And of course, there are some forms of statistical discrimination which we find objectionable. If we saw life insurance companies overtly discriminate based on race, we find that objectionable and we've made it illegal. So both forms of discrimination can result in the kind of discrimination we would like to root out. But understanding the source of the discrimination helps us think about how we might do that. Let me give you an example. Most people think that if we could just eliminate prejudice from people's hearts, both explicit and implicit biases, so that people truly judge others by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, then we will have solved the problem of discrimination. But that turns out not to be true if we understand the different sources of discrimination. A long history of discrimination based on prejudice in the United States, for example, has led to group differences between races. These group differences exist now, and even if we could wave a magic wand and get rid of all prejudice in people's hearts, those group differences would still be around. And as long as there are group differences, and as long as people don't have enough information about individuals, they're going to have an incentive to statistically discriminate based on those group differences. So just because we eliminate prejudice in people's hearts doesn't mean that we won't see discrimination based on the very categories that we used to discriminate when we discriminate based on prejudice. If you have a long history of discrimination that leads to group differences, and you eliminate discrimination based on prejudice, you're still stuck with statistical discrimination based on the group differences that emerged from past discrimination. So that makes it more challenging to think about how we actually eliminate the forms of discrimination that we think are problematic. And it makes us think more deeply about what might be necessary in terms of policy to combat discrimination.